has now been around for 3 seasons, and coaches everywhere are saving time and being more efficient when it comes to scout cards. Coach Robinson from Texas says, "The thing I most enjoy is the ease of access to all the scout cards and how I can draw on them if I need to make any changes. Every coach that uses it says that it is so great to use. If you and your staff are tired of the old ways of preparing and using scout cards, check out thecoachpad.com to start enjoying Scout Team and making the 2023 season better than ever."
Welcome back to another episode of the Gap Down Backer podcast. If you have not hit like, share, subscribe, please do so. Depending on when this comes out, we are roughly around 5,000 YouTube subscribers. So please like, share, and subscribe. Today we have the offensive line coach at Fountain High School in South Carolina, Coach Justin Ingold. Coach, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm doing good. I got let's see, a Hall of Fame ceremony to go to tonight, to recognize our school's leading rusher, and watch 2 basketball games. So see how that goes. Hopefully it goes well and without a hitch. And hopefully our boys and our girls can get a dub tonight. So
We got a couple of boys and girls W's last night in basketball. So
yeah, our girls got a win Thursday, and our boys, I think, lost by a point last night. Sorry, 4 points. So, I mean, that part sucks, but hey, it's at least they're being competitive and heading the right direction.
yes, sir.
I mean, obviously, we talked a little bit beforehand and through Twitter. Your background's a little more well diverse in terms of where you've been. Do you want to kind of talk about how you got not only to South Carolina but at Fountain Inn?
Yeah, sure. So when I got out of college in 1999, my first teaching job, and it's kind of funny because when I tell coaches down here, and I have to give them a reference point because it's so hard to refer to kind of fathom the idea of this. But I taught in a town of about 750 people. We had about 80 kids in 9 through 12, and we played 9-man football. That was my first exposure to 9-man football, and so I coached there for 4 years. And then the opportunity presented itself. A guy by the name of Rick Fillion was the head coach, and we became really good friends. And I kind of followed him to Hazen, North Dakota, where he became the head coach, and I took the same position as offensive line coach there. And then we had a run at Hazen, North Dakota. I think we had 7 straight state semifinals. We had back-to-back state championships in 2012, 2013. And then he left again, and I took over as the offensive coordinator for a few years until 2017. And at that time, my family and I moved down here to South Carolina, and I started at Eastside High School in Taylor, South Carolina, where I was an offensive line coach as well, for a year. And then a brand new high school opened up in Greenville County, Fountain Inn High School. It was the 15th high school in the district to open up. And I got into contact, or I should say, I got into contact with a fellow coach at Eastside who had taken another job. This was my first experience in the whole coaching carousel. I kind of laugh about it now. In North Dakota, you became a coach at a school, and you stayed there until you either retired, resigned, or something else. I mean, you didn't have what you see, and I'm sure it's probably the same in Ohio, where you have that constant carousel of coaching that kind of goes around. We just didn't have that. And so one of the guys, Coach Brian Smith at Eastside, took a different job, and I had contact with him and knew that I was looking, and he said, "You should get into contact." He goes, a guy that he knew, Brett Nichols, was the offensive coordinator at Gardner Webb, had taken a job as the high school coach at Fountain Inn. He said, "Contact him." And so I did. And I've been with Coach Nichols now for 4 years, I believe. I think it's 4, going on 4 years. Our first year, we just had D team, 7th and 8th graders. That was our first season. The next season, when the school opened, we had just freshmen. We played a C squad schedule. And then the next year with freshmen and sophomores, as you and I were talking about, we started with a varsity schedule of freshmen and sophomores. And this last year we finished up our season with freshmen, sophomores, juniors. Next year will be, or this next season will be the first season we'll have a full group of 9 through 12. And so I'm still coaching offensive line. I think I don't even know. I've kind of lost count. I've gotten to the point where I think it's my 23rd year, something like that. It doesn't seem like it, but that's where I'm at. So, yeah, that's kind of my background, I guess.
We'll hit on two parts of it. What would you say? I don't want injustice. What would you say the difference between teaching nine man and 11-man are? I mean, it's not as common in our Midwestern portion. 8-man's starting to get some rise, but 9-man, I know that's more of a Western
Right.
Dakotas, Montana, Idaho thing.
Yeah.
What was that kind of experience like and the differences?
I honestly think the biggest thing, especially from an offensive line perspective, is that you're playing with a couple extra or a couple less. I'm sorry, a couple less linemen, and so your typical what you would consider your tackles are technically eligible receivers, and so it was really unique to try to get into a situation like that, where you're taking guys who normally have to be a little bit athletic because they technically are tight ends and they can catch the ball, but they're at the same time they're tackles. And so essentially you're playing with a center, two guards. The biggest thing I think that you really see is just especially in a 9-man school, if you have, let's say, one or two special athletes, you're scoring 60 points a game. It's just, if you got those, two couple special athletes and you can get them out in space, it's really hard to stop that. And so my first year coaching 9-man, we went into a situation where the team had not won a game in the region in like 8 years. And my first season there, I think we tied for the region title that year, went on and actually ended up losing in the quarterfinals to the eventual state champions. But going back to that, we had some special athletes, no doubt about it. And you could really see that, with that comes a lot of success in 9-man football. So I think it just changes a little bit. Techniques are still the same. You still block the same, everything is the same that way. It's just, you kind of becomes a situation. I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but can you out athlete a team? And if you can, you're going to be successful.
Okay. And then my second question is, what is the experience, especially football wise, of opening a new building? I mean, when you're dealing with, okay, you have all freshmen, sophomores. I know playing a varsity schedule with that is not easy as well. But what would you say that experience like? What kind of lessons learned? Because that's obviously becoming more and more common in areas where schools are being opened up, especially in cities or suburbs where populations are increasing and schools are having to split in two. And what would you say that experience is like?
That's an interesting question, or an interesting topic to kind of get into, because you do have, we had a couple schools around us, but they started with, they had juniors, freshmen, sophomore, juniors in the building. We were in a unique situation where we just started with one class. So you kind of have a different, you're really literally building from the ground up. And there's all of those. I think I'm going to tell you the biggest challenge, I think, is honestly not having a class above that can kind of, hey, this is the way we do things. This is how we approach things. This is how you practice. This is how you, behave in the classroom. This is how you behave pregame. There really wasn't that leadership from the older guys kind of showing the younger guys, hey, this is how we do things. And I think as coaches, that was sort of the biggest challenge, because it kind of became us having to show that. And you as a football coach obviously know that, you can only show them so much, and they kind of have to take some ownership in that. But when you don't have an older group to kind of do that, that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, I get that. I interviewed once, God, many a year ago for a school that was doing something similar, and like I said, it's not an easy task by any means. But the reason we started talking was power, because I like to throw questions out there and ask people's opinions on things and see stuff. And then you kind of mentioned that you had been to a lot of North Dakota State clinics and watched a lot of their power stuff, and you've run some AGAP power. Um, I mean, I think most people understand what the difference between A and C gap power is. But for you, what are the kind of biggest, besides obviously the aiming point of the back and the play, do you think are kind of the biggest differences between the two plays?
Well, and again, when Coach Scott Fuchs, who I believe is still was the offensive line coach at Kansas, and I think he's still there, was at NDSU years ago. And one of the things that, an NDSU runs, like we talked about, NDSU runs it a little bit different. They run it with a tight end and usually an H-back, doing some of that stuff. And when we tend to run it a little bit more spread out, which does change a little bit in terms of, who's blocking who and where that power gap ends up being. And like I told you, we get a lot of odd front. And so when we see a lot of odd front, a lot of times that A gap power shifts a little bit more to a B gap power. And I know I sent you the one clip where we had a situation just like that, where our guys communicate up front. Essentially, they communicate on one of two things: either where the guys lined up, or if they've noticed that a zero technique is slanting hard A gap, and they'll call out, and they'll just simply say B B B A A, and then they know that that's where they got to go. We had a lot of teams that would try to do double A gap blitz kind of stuff, and when that happens, our guys will call a break call, which basically means, hey, listen, the guy you're pulling for is already in the A gap. So in a break call, you don't need to worry about pulling, because we're just going to gap down it, and we're just going to hit the B gap and hope that, that guy that we're pulling for, that middle linebacker, play side middle linebacker that we're pulling for, is already taken with the play side guard. And so the communication aspect of it, and we do a lot of power read off of that too. So we'll run a lot of A gap power with the read on the quarterback, which we were successful with in a lot of cases, running that A gap power. You get that backside linebacker flowing too hard over the top, and you hit the backside B gap with the quarterback running A gap, or what we call power read. And if that backside backer doesn't flow, then it's just the give, and you got power. And so we've worked with that quite a bit and been pretty successful with that.
Okay. And then I mean, I think most of us, or most people, recognize that it is a more of a horizontal double team. How do you teach your front side double teams in the A gap power? What are your aiming points for your offensive line?
So if we're usually on our double, it's going to double to zero. You're going to double your play side guard and your center is how we'll do it. Play side tackle is going to base block on a 4 technique. And so with the double, our center is essentially giving play side foot splits the crotch, and then he is doing basically I kind of call it a scoop technique, where he's kind of coming up with the shoulder to shoulder, kind of dipping the arm a little bit and kind of ripping through, kind of getting that shoulder turned, and then the play side guard is kind of overtaking that with a down block, getting his head in front. He's got backside hand kind of going to the back, or to the shoulder of the or the armpit of the zero, and he's just driving it. and again, with AGAP power, it hits so quick too that, and I always try to stress to my guys, listen, you don't have to make a Division I block here. You just got to get in that guy's way, let that guard kind of come through, and if you can do that, you'll have some success. So a lot of times you'll see even on our film, our play side guard is just basically stalemating that guy right in the hole, and we slip right behind it. So I think the biggest thing is, and this is something I think I've learned over the years too, is that I think as a young offensive line coach, you get into that habit of wanting to see these destruction blocks, right? You want to see guys getting moved vertically, getting all that movement, right? And I think I've learned that teaching kids that, listen, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to blow a guy up. If you can simply just at the point of attack create a gap, you'll have some success in that. And I think sometimes I overemphasize too much as a young coach of wanting to see those, we all love to see as an offensive, we all love to see those destruction blocks, right? To see a guy in his back. And but the reality of it is that doesn't happen a whole lot, so.
Okay. Now, what do you guys are typically complement with your AGAP power, or what are your personal preferences that complement with it? Maybe formationally, play wise, etc.
We do. So generally what we'll do is we'll do formation wise. We'll usually have we call it a king formation, where essentially your Y is in the kind of in that up back kind of situation, because he has an arc. He has an arc to the, again, we see a lot of odd front, so he's an arc to the outside linebacker in that situation. Excuse me. So we use a lot of that formation. We'll motion him across. We'll put him in the slot, motion him in. So we do a lot of formation, a lot of shift with him, with our Y, moving him around. And then we'll move him out and run it without him, kind of if that outside linebacker is going to go with, if he's chasing out with him, it kind of gets us where we want to go. And actually makes it a little bit easier for us without that outside linebacker sitting there. So we'll do that. Coach Nichols is, he's really good. We'll just put it. He's really good at being able to kind of diagnose some of that stuff and scheme some of that stuff with motion and shift and things like that. And then, like I was talking before, we'll complement it with, we'll power read. We have a very, very good athletic quarterback that we can run power read. He's very sharp and he's good at running the power read, and he likes to run the power read. So we'll run a lot of that off, and then we'll come back and we'll run some GH counter off of it. We'll use what we call GH counter, but more of a GY counter, I guess, because we're using the tight end. He's lining up in that same formation and he's just coming back across. And that play is also, we've had some success with that play as well. And then we'll also run an option off. We'll run a power read option off of it too. So there's a lot of different things that you can kind of, work with that formation wise, shifting, and things like that. So
Now, when you see power read option, what would you a little more specifically describe that as?
So our power read option would look, we'll generally, what we'll do is we'll orbit motion one of our receivers, give the power look, and then run the option with the orbit. So your back is running the power, and your quarterback is reading. Usually he's reading the mic, play side mic. That play side mic steps up and takes power, then he's going to pull, and now he's got the option going on the outside with the orbit motion. So we didn't run that a whole lot yet. We're still in that process of kind of getting those guys. The guys that we would run that with were freshmen, and so they, another probably next year more, we'll probably incorporate that a little bit more into what we do. Like I said, with the guys that we had, some of those things that you'd like to do, you just have to kind of, you have to kind of hold back sometimes as a coach. You want to go full throttle, and it's like, but you also got to keep in mind you got 14-year-old kids that are, trying to process all of this different stuff, and you don't want to throw all of that at them, and try to keep it, especially like I said with those young guys, try to keep it simple. I mean, it's different if you have young guys, and in a typical situation, those guys would be playing JV football, and they're not, and so you want to try to. There's that part of you as a coach that's like, hey, I want to do these things, but I got to remember that in a typical situation, these guys would be playing JV football, and it would be a lot, I don't want to say less complicated, but a lot less complex, if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And again, what do you think the biggest thing for your offensive line, or the biggest issue you encountered offensive line wise when coaching O-line has been over the past couple seasons?
I've been very fortunate that I've had 5 guys that have been and will be again, for the most part, pretty consistent. I haven't had a lot of, moving guys in and out, so they've gotten an opportunity to kind of grow with each other. There's consistency there. Really, I think the biggest things, and kind of one of the things that I really kind of reflected on for this past season too is, and I've tried to figure out if it's just the guys or the situation, but I wish my guys were a little bit more aggressive. There's a times, and they're a little complacent, and it's like, is that something that is, again, and I go back to, not as an excuse, but as a not having that older leadership. And in times I think back, it's like, okay, does that play a part in it? Not having those older guys, growing up playing football. I remember as a freshman, the older guys just beating on you, and you took your beatings, and then by the time it was your turn, you were so ready to dish that same beating out to does that make sense?
Yeah.
And our guys have never had that. They've never gotten challenged, by an older group, in practice. And if you don't get that in practice, it's hard to all of a sudden kind of turn that on in a game situation. And so that's one area that I've really tried to harp on with my guys, and try to pull some of that out. And we've gotten better. It's just not quite where I would hope I want it to be.
Okay, that makes sense. That definitely makes a lot of sense. Now, the other thing you kind of mentioned when we were chatting is just kind of your development as an O-line coach and what you've learned, and like your reflection on that. What would you say you're kind of at, especially since we've talked, your reflection and how you've learned, and recommendations for younger O-line coaches in terms of learning football?
That's a great question, because I am at that point in my career where I look back and regret things. I know, and Coach Nichols and I have talked about this, quite a bit. I know I spend more time now studying, clinics and studying than I did when I was a younger coach. Which is good. But at the same time, I think that's one of the things I wish I would have done as a younger coach, is really kind of soak all of that in. Always ask questions. I think I was, when I was a younger coach, I remember going to a clinic, and asking a question to an offensive line guy, and I can't even remember what school he was from. But and as a head coach, I'm sure you've ran across individuals like this in your dealings too, that there are some coaches that just aren't willing to answer questions. There are some coaches that just, they, for whatever reason, just don't want to, almost like you're a waste of their time. Like, who are you? Some high school? Does that make sense? And yeah. And so I think as a younger coach, I kind of got turned off a little bit, when that happened to me one time, where you almost got made feel like, okay, are you some kind of idiot? Why, And so I think in a lot of cases, I've learned that you don't have to always rely on one coach, that there's going to be another coach that will help you. There's another coach that'll answer your questions. You just have to be resourceful and willing to just, kind of put yourself out there. And I think the biggest thing is it's okay to not know everything. You're not going to know everything. And it's okay to ask questions if you're not sure. And that's the only way you can really grow as a coach. And I really think that's the only way you can grow as a teacher or as a person in general, is always be willing to ask questions if you don't know. So as a younger coach, I think that's the biggest thing. And as I talked to you about earlier too, the other big thing as a coach that I learned, I used to go into practices. I used to go into practices and I'm just like, yeah, I don't know what I'm going to do today, but I'll figure it out when I get out there. And I think that's the other thing I've taken, is that as the more experienced I've become, that I have to have a plan. There has to be a plan, and there has to be a backup to the plan, and a backup to the backup to the plan. Just because you as a head coach know there's things that happen in practice that all of a sudden you might have had an idea, but you know what, this isn't going the way I envisioned it to go. We got to switch things up. And as a position coach now, I've got to adjust. So what I thought might have been what I wanted to do, now all of a sudden I got to shift gears and do something else. And so going into practice each and every day, having a plan and then a backup plan is really, I think, a key component. The worst thing you can do as a coach is sit there in your position individual time and sit there and have, that, let me think, what can we do now? Because the kids they're going to pick up on that right away. So.
No, you're 100% right there, Coach. But speaking of individual time, the last thing I wanted to ask you about is we've talked a little bit about pod work and off-season work. What are your, how do I want to phrase this? What are your focuses in the off season with the time that you're allotted by your state, from a development standpoint, from a pod standpoint? What is kind of your focuses and like must get done in the off season?
Yeah. So as I shared with you, I actually worked on that last summer with the help of a coach, an offensive line guy out of North Carolina, Coach Tatum, out of North Carolina. He was instrumental in basically being a soundboard for me with developing this pod. Every time I'd come up with something, I'd send it to him and say, "Hey, what do you think of this? What do you think of this?" And I got to give a shout out to Coach Tatum, because he was really a big part of helping me develop that. And then, just making it, we call it pod. I came up with player offensive development, and just some random acronym. So, but player offensive development. And essentially I created a pod for the off season, basically kind of our March, where we can be in shells. We can't do any contact, but we can do a lot of technique things. And so essentially we set up, we have a gap, a gap pod day where we're running all gap scheme. We're working pull techniques. We're working just start stance, different levels of skill. The start stance kind of pod for your younger guys is crucial. And so when we send a group in, so what we did as coaches is that Coach Nelson, who is our D team / JV kind of offensive line guy, he'll take the younger guys and he'll go to a pod. Coach West runs our defensive line. He takes the defensive line and he works a pod. And then I'll take the older guys, the varsity guys, and we work a pod. So if we're working pull pod, which is simply just all pull techniques, and you and I talked about the different techniques that you can use on pull. As I told you, I used to be a skip pull guy. And now I'm more of a shuffle kind of pull. I just want them getting point A to point B as quick as they can. I don't want them worrying about, tripping over their feet, and all that kind of stuff. But we will essentially work shuffle pull. We'll work power pull, which is the old fashioned way of, pull the cord and get down the line, kick out kind of kind of pull. And so each of those pods is specifically designed to help a certain technique. And then we'll do usually 1 or 2 different pass pro pods. And so in the off season, we'll do those for about 10 minutes each. And usually there's 5 pods. So it takes about 50 minutes. And that's usually what we get, about, 45 minutes to an hour of individual time. Once we get into the season, that gets cut down to about 20, 30 minutes, and we cut our pods down. We kind of the start stance kind of stuff, once the season gets going, that kind of becomes a little bit less and less, and you get into more specific skill kind of things. And you'll do 3 pods, usually 2 run pods and a pass pod. And then on the other days, we'll do our zone pods. So all of that work is essentially zone scheme work. And the reason we do it separate, and I don't know, this is just something I do, just because I think I like to have my kids focused on one specific technique. Whether it's we're doing gap down today and zone tomorrow, that's fine. But I think if I tried to put gap scheme and zone scheme together, it just gets to be way too much for, especially for offensive line, where you're switching techniques, almost completely switching technique to do each. It just gives them sort of, like I said, a break, maybe, I don't know if that's the right word, but it helps them sort of categorize, hey, this is what I got to do for this, and these are the steps and the techniques I got to use for this. So, and then we'll run that pod system in March. We'll run it in May when we have spring practice. And then in the summer, we'll go back and we'll work pod work again all summer. And essentially, like I said, we're doing 10 minutes. It's the guys have adjusted to the fact that it's high intensity. We make the groups a little bit smaller. I go back to, when I first started coaching, excuse me, and I had maybe, 10, 15 offensive linemen. And now in a situation like where I've got maybe 40 to 50 offensive linemen, it just became, to me, and I'm kind of a control freak, in the sense that, hey, I want to see what each individual's doing. And I just realized after the last season, I'm like, I can't do that. I can't have an effective, worthwhile practice. I can't possibly see every single individual for every single technique. And so I just had to kind of let some of that go for some of my, like I said, Coach Nelson, Coach Robinson, have been really good, trust in them that they'll kind of handle some of those things. And I can just focus on one particular group. And so that's what we're going to kind of continue to work with, and just understand that once you get into those pod work, you're going 100 miles an hour, and it's high intensity. It's a lot of reps. And then, we'll move on from there.
Okay. No, perfect, Coach. So coaches, give Coach a follow on Twitter. It will be in the bio. I think he mentioned Coach Tatum. I know Coach Tatum's also started up all of his stuff again. So don't hesitate to check that stuff out as well. Otherwise, I think that's another episode of the Get Down Backer podcast. Like, share, subscribe, all that lovely jazz. And thank you for listening. Thanks, Coach.
Appreciate you, Coach. Thank you.